right. Good afternoon, y'all. I hope you are doing well. Welcome back to Beyond John Ethics and Community in Early Christianity, which is our series on largely the Apostolic Fathers. This is episode 5, which I've entitled The Most Influential Father You've Never Heard of. And I'll explain what that means as we go here. We're going to be covering a text called the Martyrdom of Polycarp today. But before we do that, I want to retrace some of our ground from last time. We spent our last session together covering the letters of Ignatius of Antioch. So Ignatius of Antioch died approximately 150 CE, and his letters were written in, the couple of decades before his death. And a couple of these are going to be important to what we cover today. But first of all, in these 7 letters, 6 are written to churches, 1 to Polycarp, a bishop. But it's clear from the language that Ignatius uses that there are very tight connections among the churches during this time period. And that will become, I think, even more evident in a few slides when I discuss briefly sort of the size of early Christian communities during this time period. But one of the other things that we saw in Ignatius's letters is the notion that imitation of Christ, specifically as it relates to martyrdom, is seen as very important. Ignatius used the language of being a disciple in terms of martyrdom. And we also noted that for Ignatius, it was important that Christian gatherings should be frequent, but also should be governed by the officers of the church. So these two things, frequent gatherings, celebration of the sacraments, under the authority and supervision of the church officers, is a key part of the church's life. Ignatius was also emphasizing this sort of 3-office system of church government, where you have a bishop overseeing the church in a particular region, presbyters or elders leading the church, and then deacons as well. And he used the language of the lyre to describe the sort of harmony that he wanted to see in the churches. So the elders sort of being attuned to the bishops, taking pitch from God, sort of this musical analogy used to describe the unity that Ignatius wanted the churches to have using this system of church government. Perhaps more relevant to our material for today is the notion of martyrdom. Ignatius wrote those 7 letters as he was being transported to Rome to face trial and presumably execution. And so he knows that he is headed towards his death. And his perspective is that true discipleship, if you think of discipleship as following Jesus, true discipleship is martyrdom. That is literally following Jesus in the footsteps of suffering and death. He uses language like, I am beginning to be a disciple. Here at the end of his life, he's beginning to be a disciple. Well, he's talking about martyrdom. Now that he is actually facing his own death, he is beginning to be a disciple. He is embarking upon this path of discipleship. He also speaks of, being consumed by beasts. Then I will truly be a disciple. So the point here is that one who follows Christ should be one who follows Christ in death. And I say this is sort of seemingly weird. I mean, Ignatius seems awfully positive about his death, about his martyrdom. And that could be read as sort of being pro-martyrdom. Like, oh, well, true Christianity is proactively volunteering to go die for Christ. And I don't think Ignatius actually takes it that far, but as we'll see with the martyrdom of Polycarp, that story of Polycarp's martyrdom takes care to sort of temper that sort of sentiment that martyrdom is something that should be proactively pursued. We'll get into that in a bit here. But, you do have things like, Ignatius saying specifically to the church in Rome, which is where he's headed, don't hinder me, don't prevent me from being martyred, don't interfere, do not hinder me. So he does have this language of allow me to be an imitator of the suffering of my God. So I would say Ignatius is more accepting his fate and going to it willingly rather than sort of pursuing martyrdom as its own spiritual good. Ignatius also viewed suffering and martyrdom as a witness alongside Scripture. So prophecies persuading folks, the law, the gospel, individual suffering, these are all things that persuade, or perhaps not in the case of sort of very resistant people, but these are all things that persuade and convince concerning the Christian message. And I also included this quote from Paul Foster. He says, such an attitude reflects the countercultural attitudes exhibited in early Christianity, whereby acts of martyrdom became world-negating events that served to rob the Roman Empire and the dominion of Satan of their power, and demonstrated the victory of Christ over the world. Okay, now we finally get to Polycarp. Polycarp was born approximately in 69 CE. We know for reasonably certain the date of his death. So that is typically placed around 155. And in the Martyrdom of Polycarp, it says that he was, I believe, 86 years old at the time of his death. So if we count backwards, so he is in this sort of first generation of Christians in the post-apostolic period. And he apparently actually knew John the Apostle. I believe I mentioned that in one of our very first sessions. So Polycarp is sort of this next generation of Christian. And before we actually get to the story of the martyrdom of Polycarp, I wanted to note a couple things from Ignatius's letter to Polycarp. We talked about Ignatius. What sort of advice might Ignatius have for someone like Polycarp, who is the bishop of Smyrna in modern-day Turkey? We see Ignatius trying to impress upon Polycarp that sort of oversight that he was commending. So the bishops and presbyters and deacons overseeing the activities of the church. So Ignatius says, let nothing happen without your consent, nor do anything yourself without God, as indeed you do not do. Be firm. Let your meetings be often as possible. Seek out everyone by name. So a couple notes here. We have the bishop orchestrating events and sort of the practice of Christianity for the people, and the bishop then being in tune with God. That kind of reflects that sort of musical metaphor that Ignatius used previously. But here's a couple interesting things. So number one, let your meetings be as often as possible. Seek out everyone by name. Later in the letter, Ignatius himself says, I greet everyone by name. There was a question last week about the size of early Christian communities. What size of a group are we talking about wherein it is possible to greet everyone by name? This is pastoral advice that Ignatius is giving to Polycarp, the bishop, the regional pastoral overseer for Smyrna. And so how many Christians are we talking about that it would even be feasible for Polycarp in the execution of his pastoral duty to seek out everyone by name? Are we talking hundreds of people? What are we talking about here? And I think this is actually kind of important because sometimes we read even the New Testament epistles and we actually don't have a clear idea of how many people Paul is talking about, for example, when he admonishes the Corinthians or when he says, "Oh, foolish Galatians." How many folks are we dealing with? Similarly, Paul, in some of his letters, sends specific greetings to specific people. John, the apostle, says to greet the friends by name. So, interesting question. What is the scale of the Christian community at this time? I got this table from Rodney Stark's book, The Rise of Christianity. And he sort of describes the logic and reasoning behind these figures. I won't go into that now, but suffice it to say that at least one way of thinking about this that Stark presents is projecting approximately a 40% growth in the Christian community, the Christian population of the Roman Empire, 40% growth per decade. So if you think of beginning around 40 CE and moving from there, 40% growth per decade. And you might think, looking at those first couple of numbers, well, hey, wait a minute, what about all of the people in Acts that we read about being added to the number of Christians? Well, it's difficult to say if all of them persisted in the faith or exactly what was happening. You kind of have that supposedly large explosion of growth in Acts. This is, I would say, more of an attempt to reason sort of forwards from the New Testament accounts, but also backwards from information that we have in the centuries later. But I think at least when we get to the end of the first century and the sort of middle of the second century there, this seems to be a reasonable estimation. So if you think about 150 CE, that's approximately when we're talking about, in terms of Polycarp and Ignatius, approximately 40,000 Christians in the Roman Empire. And as you can see, this 40% growth per decade builds up fairly quickly, so that by the time you get to the era of Nicene Christianity, the Council of Nicaea, you have about 6 million Christians in the Roman Empire. So, take that for what it is. But the point here is that if you think about approximately 40 to 50,000 Christians in the Roman Empire, all located throughout various large cities and perhaps smaller areas as well, individual Christian churches would actually be quite small. So perhaps 30 to 100 people. I am not sort of well versed in all of the sort of social history that goes into some of these numbers, but if you think about this in relation to what we're reading about, that kind of makes sense. So we aren't really dealing with, especially in the New Testament epistles, we aren't dealing with hundreds and hundreds of people. These churches are quite small. And so when you read the apostles, writing the New Testament texts, admonishing Christians in these churches for various things and encouraging them to repent and whatnot, the apostles are likely thinking of individual people. They're writing with very specific situations in mind. And so it helps to keep that in mind. These are very intimate letters. Anyways, so I thought that was interesting. It was interesting to kind of think about that. As for the Martyrdom of Polycarp itself, this is our oldest independent Christian martyrdom text. And by that I mean it is a standalone story. It does not come in the context of a collection of martyrdom stories such as Jerome's Illustrious Men, or other collections of martyrdom stories. But it is an independent martyrdom story, and it's also, I believe, the earliest one that we have, really. It's written in the mid-2nd century, so shortly after Polycarp's death. It's influenced by Jewish martyrdom texts. So if you read the books of Maccabees, for example, you have a lot of stories in there of Jewish martyrs. And there are elements here in the Martyrdom of Polycarp that are similar. The martyr as sort of an innocent victim, for example, the martyr praying before their death, different things like that are similar. And so you sort of have this blending of genres, sort of the form of the Jewish martyrdom text being combined actually with an epistle. So by this time, the writings of Paul and others are well known and are in use in the churches as scripture, basically. The canon formation is complex, and there's a lot of other things we could say, but they're at least acknowledged as having apostolic authority, and sort of the epistolary genre, the letter, has become a sort of peculiarly Christian thing. Letters are a key part of how the apostolic tradition is viewed. And so, as we'll see, the Martyrdom of Polycarp is actually in letter format. So it's a martyrdom story embedded within a letter. And so this is, in many ways, a uniquely Christian document in that it combines sort of the Jewish martyrdom influence with the uniquely Christian epistle format. And it's also a text that gains wide acceptance in the early church. It was distributed widely. It was quite a popular story. Polycarp was an immensely influential bishop in the early church, and so his death was a big deal. It was quite impactful. And so the story of his death and the example that the authors of the Martyrdom of Polycarp were trying to set forth for the churches was distributed throughout the early church. So we're going to cover 3 things with reference to the Martyrdom of Polycarp. So number 1, rhetorical purpose. I always try to cover that. It's important. We want to know, why exactly is this document being written? What is it for? That is just a really important part of addressing any text. Any of these documents, whether we're talking about the Apostolic Fathers or the New Testament texts, they are texts being written from someone to someone else, relating something for a particular purpose and in response to a particular event. I mean, that is true of virtually all of the New Testament literature, and it is true of the Martyrdom of Polycarp. And so we want to know what that purpose is, so that we can better understand the story. And then we're going to cover the story itself. I'm going to take you through sort of the main story beats. I'm not going to cover all of the details. There are a lot of little details in this story. So I would actually encourage you, if you're interested, to read it. It is a fascinating story. I first read the Martyrdom of Polycarp when I was, in like 7th or 8th grade, which may explain some things about who I am today. I don't know. But it is a classic of Christian literature, I would say. And it is a fascinating story in and of itself. So I'm not going to cover all the little interesting bits, but I'm going to take you through the main contours of the story, point out some important things as we go. And then, finally, at the end, we're going to ask, what is the example that Christians are being presented with? Our purpose here is in this class, is to look at the ethics of the early church and the community of the early church. And so, what picture of martyrdom does this story present to a Christian community that is being faced with the reality of an arbitrary and unjust legal system that may be used as a weapon against them? That's basically the question. So, having said that, let's go. So the rhetorical purpose of the Martyrdom of Polycarp is very simple: to present an example of martyrdom to the church. In the very first section. And here you can hear the sort of epistolary letter style intro to this. And it is written, in fact, I didn't put this on the slide, but let me, just so you can kind of get a sense for the letter elements here. It says at the very beginning, the Church of God, the one temporarily residing in Smyrna, to the Church of God, the one temporarily residing in Philomelium, and to all gatherings of the Holy and Catholic Church which reside in every place. So that is reminiscent of 1 Clement, the church temporarily residing here in the world in these various locations. But it's interesting that this letter, this story, is sent not only to the church in Philomelium, but to all gatherings of the church. So this is written apparently in mind, with the fact in mind that this story will be distributed, that this is a value to all Christians. But it says, we write to you, brothers, the account of those who were martyred. For nearly all the things that happened previously happened in order that the Lord might demonstrate to us again a martyrdom in accordance with the gospel. Keep that phrase in mind, a martyrdom in accordance with the gospel. That has sort of a dual meaning that we'll see as we go. But the point here is largely that those who endure martyrdom faithfully are noble sufferers. They are imitators of Christ whose example should be followed. So the point here is to present through the figure of Polycarp a noble example of what it means to follow Christ in martyrdom. At the very beginning of the story, before we even get to Polycarp, and it's sort of alluded to that there are others who were martyred along with Polycarp. Their stories are not really very important or really addressed at all. But we do have two examples that are given to us before Polycarp. One good, one bad. And if you read this story, you'll see throughout the phrase, away with the atheists. And so the question of what are Christians actually being charged with that they might be executed, that is something we'll get to next time. But the charge of atheism comes up in this story. And you might think, okay, atheism, that doesn't fit because obviously Christians believe in a God. They're not atheists. Well, we have to understand that atheism in the ancient context is not the same as atheism in our modern context. In our modern context, an atheist is one who does not believe in God or any supernatural deity or being. In the ancient context, an atheist is one who does not honor the Roman gods. So atheism is not so much... it's not so much about what you think about the supernatural, but it's more about, do you honor the gods, or at least some god, or not? And so because Christians did not worship in the same way as many other ancient religious groups, they didn't have idols, there's no visible way in which they are worshiping a god, they were charged with atheism, of rejecting the gods. And that is sort of, as we'll cover later on, that's sort of a threat to, in some ways, the sort of Roman religious political establishment. Okay, so we have two individuals who are sort of at issue here. We have Germanicus. So these are both Christians who are on trial before Polycarp. Germanicus, he encourages his fellow Christians who are imprisoned with him. He faces the beasts bravely. Says that when the proconsul asked him to consider his youth, that is, hey, you're a young guy, like, don't throw your life away. Just, submit to the Roman government, swear by Caesar, and you'll be fine. The proconsul asked him to consider his youth. He forcefully dragged himself to the beast. And so you have Germanicus sort of proactively embracing his death. The text says something to the effect of, so that he might, escape this unjust world. I don't think he's necessarily like embracing martyrdom in an inappropriate way, but he's sort of showing bravery, and he is collected in the face of danger. There's another individual called Quintus. He actually gave himself up to be martyred. He sort of confessed to being a Christian or something like that. He went voluntarily. And so this is one of the issues. People volunteering or embracing martyrdom in an inappropriate way, sort of chasing after martyrdom. And so he volunteers, but he's then persuaded by the proconsul to swear by Caesar. So he ultimately turns out to be a coward, even though he was all gung-ho about pursuing martyrdom. And so the narrator of the story says, we do not praise those who hand themselves over, because the gospel does not so teach. So you have here the notion that the gospel in some way gives us instructions for martyrdom somehow. Kind of interesting. We'll come back to that. So on to Polycarp. Early on in the story, he has a vision of a flaming pillow. His pillow catches on fire, or so he envisions. And he takes this to be a prophetic sign that he is to be burned alive. And so he predicts his own death by saying, I must be burned alive. And so ultimately he's betrayed by two members of his own household. And here we're going to see parallels with Jesus' story. He's betrayed by members of his own house, kind of like Judas. He's sought out and found by the Roman police, and he's arrested by Herod, the captain of the police. Interesting. So kind of a parallel to Herod in the Gospels. And the police come to arrest him, and they're armed. They're arresting him on the Jewish day of preparation. And the text says they're armed as if advancing against a rebel. So this kind of calls to mind Jesus saying to the group that comes to arrest him, like, what, do you think I'm a robber that you need to have all these weapons? So we're starting to see parallels between the story of Polycarp and the story of Jesus. Polycarp proceeds to pray for everyone in the church. That is not an exaggeration. He prays for everyone that he has met who's a Christian, and he prays for everyone in the whole church, in the whole world, the universal church. So he prays, and then after he finishes going through all of these names, he is led away. And so you have this picture of Polycarp as this extremely pious person, this extremely faithful person. And he's led into the city on a donkey. Okay, so hints of the triumphal entry, perhaps. This is kind of a weird thing. So they take him immediately to the stadium. So the proconsul and other officials are there putting on gladiatorial games. And so they take him immediately to the stadium. So he's not taken to the governor's compound or something where a trial might happen, but he's taken immediately to the stadium. And as he's being led into the stadium, we hear a voice from heaven. Be strong, Polycarp. Be a man. And so a voice from heaven, kind of similar to things that you might remember from the Gospels. For example, the voice from heaven at Jesus' baptism, or even the risen Christ appearing to Paul on the road to Damascus. It says no one but those of our people heard it. So no one hears the voice seemingly except other Christians. Interesting. And so he's brought before the proconsul. The proconsul, of course, is just a Roman official, a regional governor. And he attempts to persuade Polycarp to revile Christ. And so he's trying to get Polycarp to reject Christ, to deny Christ, and to swear by Caesar. Now, just a comment here, and this kind of jumps ahead to some things we're going to talk about next time, but I'll just sort of introduce this idea here. It does not appear that there is any specific law on the books in the Roman Empire that makes Christianity illegal. And so there's a question of what exactly is Polycarp being charged with? There is no mention of a crime that he's accused of. And I think there's a reason for that, and we'll get to it later on. But, you know, it's not illegal per se to be a Christian. You know, I'll want to nuance that next time and talk more about kind of the legal situation there. But at least in the text here, the Martyrdom of Polycarp, it's not as if he is put on trial for being a Christian. The proconsul is simply attempting to get him to honor Caesar, to worship Caesar, to swear by Caesar, however you want to think of that. Swearing by the fortune of Caesar or the genius of Caesar is kind of the common phrase. And so Polycarp responds, and this is, I think, one of the more famous lines from this text. He says, 86 years I have served him, and he has done me no wrong. How could I blaspheme my king who saved me? So very, very stirring, powerful lines from Polycarp there. And he goes on, the proconsul attempts to persuade him again. And Polycarp says, I am a Christian. And this phrase, I am a Christian, kind of becomes a common feature of Christian martyrdom stories. I believe Sum Christianus comes up in the Martyrdom of Perpetua. But he says something interesting. He says, and if you wish to learn the account of Christianity, set a day and listen. And so he's basically saying, if you want me to provide a defense of myself, schedule a trial, right? Remember, they're in the stadium. They're in the midst of the games. The people are there, the crowds are there, and the proconsul is basically having an ad hoc mini trial, which does not seem to be normal practice. And so the proconsul then says, persuade the people. So he's saying, well, make your defense before the people, and if they approve of you, I will spare you. But Polycarp is not going to go in for this sort of ad hoc judicial process, right? He says, I do not consider them worthy that a defense should be made before them. And I don't think he's really saying, these people are not worthy to hear me speak. That's not so much it. But he's saying this is not, I'm not going to indulge this sort of irregular judicial process. If you want a trial, you can schedule one. Otherwise, whatever, man. And by the way, at various points in the text, it talks about the crowds knowing who Polycarp is, and indeed calling for him to be put on trial or for the proconsul to decide what to do with him. And so it seems that Polycarp is somewhat known in the community, if this account is to be believed. Kind of interesting. ultimately, the proconsul threatens to burn Polycarp. There's this situation where he initially threatens Polycarp with being thrown to beasts, but I believe it talks about how the proconsul has already used up all of the allotted beasts for the day, and they don't have any extra beasts to use, and so they have to threaten Polycarp with being burned. And this is another one of the famous lines from this story. Polycarp responds to this threat of being burned, and remember that Polycarp has already seen a vision of his pillow being on fire. He already prophetically knows that he will be burned. And he says, "You threaten with fire that burns for a while, and after a little time is extinguished. For you are ignorant of the fire of the coming judgment and eternal punishment reserved for the ungodly. But why do you wait? Bring about what you wish." And I kind of enjoy one of the older translations, one of the older English translations of this section. He says, "Bring forth what thou wilt." Kind of a classic, like if this were turned into like a sword and sandal movie, that would be the line. I just realized my face was almost covering up the thing. So Polycarp says, "Do with me what you want." And so they prepare the fire. And interestingly, they at first move to nail down Polycarp to prevent him from moving or escaping or throwing himself out of the fire. But he asks not to be nailed down, but simply to be left tied up. So this is actually a divergence from parallels with Christ not being nailed down like Christ on the cross, but simply remaining bound and sort of steadfastly remaining of his own will in the fire. And then Polycarp proceeds to pray what seems to be a liturgical style prayer. And as soon as he says amen, they light the fire. It's very dramatic. And here is where some of the sort of miraculous elements of this story start cropping up. The fire is roaring around Polycarp's body. It's described as being like a house or a building that Polycarp is within, or a sail that billows out with the wind. So it's all around him, but not touching him. And it describes a scent, not like flesh burning, but like bread baking, or like gold and silver being refined in a furnace. For we also perceived an intense fragrance. So there's this sort of, it's almost like the men in the fiery furnace in the Old Testament, Daniel. The fire being around them, but not harming them. His body is not being burned up by the fire. And so kind of another parallel to Christ, an executioner stabs him. And out of his body flies a dove. And his blood flows down and actually puts out the fire, which is kind of interesting. And so his reference to the fire that burns for a little while and after a little time is extinguished is sort of made reality with his blood flowing out. Again, kind of a parallel to Christ, blood and water flowing from Christ's side when he is stabbed by the centurion's spear on the cross. And then some things happen with his body. His body is burned and it is taken away. But sort of the outcome of this, the main point for the reader is made clear in 17:3. May we also become both the martyr's partners and be fellow disciples. So once again, this notion of martyrdom and discipleship sort of going along together. Okay, and the story sort of ends in this way. It says in 19:1, "Such is the account of the blessed Polycarp. He was not only a well-known teacher, but also a distinguished martyr, whose martyrdom all desire to imitate. It happened in accordance with the gospel of Christ. So that reference to in accordance with, in accordance with the gospel of Christ, I mentioned there's a double meaning there. You can see that not only is Polycarp sort of being obedient to various instructions for disciples in the Gospels, but even his manner of death follows various points of the story of Christ's passion. And so the phrase in accordance with the gospel is sort of a double entendre in that he's not only being obedient to the gospel in the sense of the commands of Christ, he's not only following Christ, but he's actually living out in some ways in a literal fashion the story of Christ's crucifixion. But you can see that at various points the story differs. So he's not completely copying Christ, but he is shown to be an imitator. Not a duplicate, but an imitator. So here's some things to think about. The purpose of this story is to set the example of Polycarp before the churches as an example of martyrdom. So ultimately, what is the example that is being set forth? And I want to make a comment about, I was debating whether or not to go into all of the details and do kind of a blow-by-blow analysis of this, but the way that Polycarp's trial, if you even want to call it that, is carried out is unusual. Normally, and I mean, we basically see all of this sort of stuff in the context of the gospel accounts of Jesus' trial. But Polycarp doesn't really get a trial. As I sort of hinted at before, he's sort of dragged straight to the stadium, brought to the proconsul, and questioned and forced to listen to the proconsul, try to get him to swear by Caesar. But there's no trial, really. There's no council that puts him on trial. There are no formal legal charges. And so it's just unusual. And I'm kind of drawing on an argument by, I believe, Sarah Parvis, just pointing to the fact that this portrayal of Roman justice, it seems like either the writers are ignorant of how things are actually supposed to go, or perhaps more likely, the Romans are being portrayed as unjust in their execution of justice. This is a somewhat arbitrary sort of enacting of justice. And if you're a Christian, that makes sense. The fact that the Romans are persecuting Christians is a little arbitrary. It doesn't quite add up. And for all of their, I don't know, sort of unvirtuous habits, the Romans were concerned with justice, especially if you were a Roman citizen. Paul, for example, being able to request audiences with various Roman officials, governors, Caesar even. We don't get any of that sort of legal process here in the Martyrdom of Polycarp. And so all that to say, the Roman justice system is being portrayed as arbitrary, unusual, and unjust. And so in the face of imperial powers that are arbitrarily putting Christians on trial, and treating them in this unjust way, what are Christians to do? Well, they are to imitate Christ. They are to follow the example of Polycarp. And you'll see throughout that Polycarp does not seek martyrdom. He does not pursue it. And you might think, well, okay, but at the beginning of the story, he said, I must be burned with fire. He has this prophetic vision, and isn't he sort of moving towards his own death? He is prophetically, apparently, acknowledging that that is how he will die. That is God's plan, apparently. But he is not actively pursuing martyrdom. And there is here, I think, the notion that Polycarp is, or at least the authors of the Martyrdom of Polycarp, are sort of tempering Ignatius's language. So Ignatius was saying, Romans, do not hinder me. Church in Rome, do not prevent me from undergoing this. This is my destiny, to be martyred. Don't interfere. Let me go. Allow me to imitate Christ in suffering. And that could be read as perhaps overly positive. I don't think that was Ignatius's actual intention. But during this time period, you had people who were sort of prizing the spiritual over the physical. Remember this theme in, I believe, 2 Clements, obedience in the flesh, being spiritually important and vital to the church's witness. Don't abandon the flesh. Don't abandon your obedience to God in the here and now by throwing yourself upon the sword of martyrdom. Don't pursue martyrdom in that way. This was an actual problem. You had people wishing to sort of gain, easy imitation of Christ by volunteering to be martyred, which is a little bit counterintuitive, but people sometimes latch hold of religious ideas in strange ways, particularly when it comes to important issues such as life and death. And so I think the Martyrdom of Polycarp, the story here, is cautioning against that. His example is one that does not pursue martyrdom, but nonetheless endures it faithfully. So this notion of imitation of Christ and discipleship being very tightly connected, even with reference to death. The other thing is that the text of Martyrdom of Polycarp speaks of the martyrs, not only Polycarp, but it makes sort of very brief reference to those who were martyred with him. It speaks of them as if they did not feel pain. It uses the language of the fire feeling cold to them. And so you get this picture of, it's, if you kind of read it uncritically or in a careless way, you can get the sense that, oh, well, they're just like gliding through martyrdom, no problem. It didn't hurt or anything. And if that's the case, why wouldn't you just pursue martyrdom? If it's not going to hurt, just sort of imitate Christ in your death, and there you go. You are now an imitator of Christ. But I don't think that's quite the point. The point is not to emphasize some sort of miraculous painlessness that goes along with martyrdom, but rather it's to emphasize the fact that Christ is with those who suffer in their martyrdom. Again, the example of the men in the fiery furnace in Daniel, not feeling the flames. Why? Because God was with them. And so these references to these sort of miraculous instances, whether or not we accept them as being authentic, there's kind of explanations for everything, right? You can explain all of those miraculous instances and their presence in the story through sort of non-supernatural things. But the point is, and I think their presence in the story is down to the idea that Christ is with those who suffer for him. And so you have imitation of Christ on the one hand, but also the presence of Christ with his people who are suffering. And also this notion of a martyrdom, as the very beginning of this letter said, a martyrdom according to the gospel. And so, in some way, these early Christians looked at the gospel as a guide for how to imitate Christ and how to become martyrs or witnesses, not only in terms of their death, but in life as well, witnesses to Christ. And if you were with us for our series on the Gospel of Luke, that is very much present in Luke's Gospel. Discipleship, notions of obedience unto death, those are all present in the Gospels. So, my point here today was to largely give you an overview of the story and to cover at least a few of the key things when it comes to this example of Polycarp that was being presented to the churches. However, there are lots of lingering questions still that we may have about sort of the practicalities of martyrdom and persecution in the early church, such as what were Christians actually being charged with? I made mention of the charge of atheism, but how did that work legally? Who was accusing Christians of being atheists or committing other crimes that would get them in these situations where they would be put on trial and perhaps killed? Was Christianity illegal? What was the deal? Was there actually widespread state-level persecution of Christians? In other words, is the Roman government actually proactively trying to arrest and execute Christians? Were there really Roman police actually rounding Christians up and feeding them to animals? And then also, why is the issue of voluntary martyrdom or seeking your own death in an inappropriate way, why was that so important to address? Why is that such a big deal? These are all really important questions. I think there are a lot of misconceptions about the nature of persecution in the early church. We sort of think it's like Nazi Germany, and Christians are analogous to Jews in hiding, which is not quite the case. We also think about persecution as being primarily driven by imperial authorities. In some cases, yes, but in some cases, that's not quite how it played out. And so next time, I'm going to talk about another text, the Epistle to Ignatius, and we'll use that as sort of a springboard to think about the notion of persecution and to talk about some of the actual historical realities. If this is the example that was being presented to Christians in the 2nd century as to a noble Christ-like experience of martyrdom, what are the actual historical realities that they're facing? If this is the example, what is the problem that this example is trying to help Christians solve, if that makes sense? So that'll be next time. So we will cover the Epistle to Ignatius next time. As always, I will be doing a Q&A video on Wednesday. So that is where I take 10 minutes to answer any questions that I get from y'all. So that's just meant to be kind of a brief 10-minute video where I can sort of address some things that maybe y'all are wondering about or things that I didn't have time to get to today. I do really enjoy doing those. They're always really interesting. And I hope y'all are finding those to be interesting and helpful as well. So if you have any questions that you'd like me to cover, just let me know. Send me a message through whatever medium makes the most sense to you. And I will make sure to go over that question in my video on Wednesday evening. So having said that, I will stop there. So I will see you all on Wednesday for Q&A, and then next Sunday to talk about the Epistle to Ignatius and persecution of Christians in the 2nd century. So I'll see y'all later. Peace be with you.